The widow's oil shows how God meets empty places. The first empty thing in 2 Kings 4 was not a jar. It was a household being emptied by death, debt, and the threat of separation. A widow cried out to Elisha because her husband had died, and a creditor was coming for her 2 sons. The narrative gives no hint that her trouble was punishment for hidden rebellion. She reminds Elisha that her husband feared the Lord. Faithfulness had not made the family immune to grief or economic danger. Then Elisha asked a question that seems almost too small for the emergency before him. "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house?" The jar could not settle the debt by its ordinary value. The widow could not rescue the household through resourcefulness alone. What remained in the house mattered because God chose to work through it. Elisha told her to borrow empty vessels, close the door with her sons, and pour. Why would the answer require borrowed containers? Why would the miracle happen behind a closed door, and why would the oil stop? The answers unfold only as the widow moves from her nearly empty house to borrowed vessels, a shut door, and an oil supply that eventually stops. The cry was about more than money. Her answer was exact. "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." The story turns on that phrase without becoming a lesson about positive thinking. The widow begins by naming 3 facts. Her husband is dead. He feared the Lord. The creditor is coming for her sons. Those sentences belong together. Death has removed the person who once shared the burden of the household. Debt now places the remaining family at risk. Her sons are not an abstract symbol of the future. They are the children she may soon watch being taken through the doorway because the house cannot meet its obligation. 2 Kings 4 lets the financial crisis retain its full weight. The debt matters. The legal vulnerability matters. The possibility of family separation matters. That is one reason the creditor should not be turned into a cartoon villain. Such a reading would go beyond what is written and distract from the widow's exposure. She has no visible means to reverse what is approaching, and the cost of that powerlessness may be paid by her sons. Her cry reaches Elisha before the creditor reaches the house. There is faith in that movement, though it sounds nothing like triumph. She brings the real emergency into the presence of God's prophet. The debt remains plainly named, and the loss is never renamed as blessing. She says what has happened and what is about to happen. Biblical lament often begins there, with enough reverence to tell the truth. The woman's reference to her husband's fear of the Lord also protects the story from another shallow conclusion. Scripture warns against foolish borrowing, dishonesty, and neglect. But this passage offers no accusation of moral failure against the family. A household connected to the prophetic community has still become economically fragile. The Bible is more honest about suffering than many of our formulas. A person can fear God and still face a bill that cannot be paid. A family can live faithfully and still be wounded by death. Material crisis is not automatic proof that God has rejected someone. And spiritual devotion does not make a person untouchable by the pressures of life in a broken world. The widow's words also reveal how quickly grief can become a practical emergency. The death of her husband is not left in the realm of emotion. It changes the structure of the household. A voice is missing, but so is income, protection, and the ability to answer a creditor. Sorrow and economics occupy the same room. That is important because religious reflection sometimes honors grief only when it remains inward. Tears are treated as spiritual, while rent, food, contracts, and debt are treated as lesser concerns. 2 Kings 4 refuses that division. The God who receives the widow's cry also addresses the material condition threatening her children. Elisha listens to the crisis as it actually is. Then he asks what remains in the house. The question leaves the scale of her need intact. It directs the story toward the one item the widow has almost stopped counting. Nothing except kept the lack and the remainder together. The widow says she has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. She neither exaggerates the jar nor erases it. Nothing except holds the entire tension of the scene. The house is nearly depleted, yet one ordinary possession remains. Its presence cannot solve the crisis, yet its smallness cannot make it meaningless. That distinction matters because this story is often flattened into the advice, use what you have. Such a reading can make the widow sound as though she merely needed to recognize an overlooked business opportunity. But the jar, by itself, could not preserve her sons. The answer would require an act of God. The oil is not proof of secret self-sufficiency. It is the material through which divine provision enters the scene. Elisha's question requires the widow to name the situation accurately. She must look at the house without pretending it is full and without declaring the remainder non-existent. The wording gives dignity to both truths. The family lacks what it needs. Something is still there. That balance is easily lost in human suffering. Scarcity can become so loud that whatever remains begins to feel insulting. A small resource may seem irrelevant beside a large debt. One stable relationship may feel painfully inadequate after a major loss. A little strength may seem worthless when the whole future feels uncertain. 2 Kings 4 never asks the widow to regard the jar as already sufficient. It becomes sufficient only through a mercy she cannot manufacture. This keeps the focus on the distinction within her answer. God never assigns the last thing in the house the power to save her. He asks her to place that last thing inside an act of obedience. The difference is theological, not merely emotional. Human participation will matter, but it will never become the source of the miracle. The widow can name the oil, carry it, and pour it. She cannot command it to multiply. Two distortions are refused at once. Despair says the remainder has no meaning. Self-reliance says the remainder has all the power required. Neither conclusion fits the story. The jar matters. God provides. The widow's answer is therefore neither pessimism nor optimism. It is testimony. She speaks truthfully about the condition of the house before she knows what God will do there. That honesty becomes the doorway into the next command. She is never asked to rename poverty as abundance. She is asked to bring the one remaining jar under the word she has received. The oil will not become meaningful because she changes her attitude toward it. It becomes meaningful because God acts beyond its natural limit. That difference protects the story from becoming self-help with biblical objects. The widow is not taught that every answer is already hidden inside her. She is shown that the God of Israel can work through something small without confusing the small thing with the source. And the next instruction makes clear that the answer will not remain confined to what the widow's own house can supply. The answer required borrowed capacity. Elisha tells the widow to go outside and borrow from her neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. The command exposes her need beyond the walls of the house. She must knock on doors and ask for containers she cannot provide herself. Those conversations are left unrecorded. We are not told what the neighbors knew, what they asked, or how they responded emotionally. What we do see is that vessels belonging to other households became part of the capacity through which provision would be received. The neighbors did not produce the oil. Their containers still mattered. The narrator remains restrained about the neighbors. We cannot know whether they understood the crisis, offered comfort, or knew what the vessels would become. Their role is material and limited. They lend empty space. That silence keeps us from turning the scene into an idealized portrait of community that is never described. Even so, the borrowed vessels reveal something important. The answer to the widow's private crisis includes objects she cannot obtain by remaining sealed inside the house. She must cross thresholds, make requests, receive what belongs to others, and carry it home. That is a precise picture of grace and human dependence. Divine provision may still arrive through something received from another person. Here, obedience includes borrowing. The widow cannot preserve her dignity by pretending she needs no one, nor is she reduced to passivity. She must gather what the prophetic word requires. Her sons are involved as well. They carry the vessels into the house. The family whose future is under threat begins moving together before the outcome is visible. The words, "not too few," invite serious obedience, but they should not be turned into a universal technique. The verse gives no basis for claiming that people can force God to multiply provision according to the size of their imagination. This is a specific prophetic instruction within a specific crisis. The widow's responsibility is to take the word seriously. She cannot create oil. She can borrow vessels. She cannot settle the debt by effort alone. She can prepare the space the instruction has named. The emptiness of the containers is important. A vessel already occupied cannot receive what is about to be poured. Yet the story never romanticizes emptiness. An empty jar has no power of its own. It is simply available capacity. That keeps the miracle from becoming an allegory in which emptiness itself earns abundance. The vessels are practical objects in a real household crisis. Their usefulness lies in receiving oil that only God can continue supplying. Once the containers are gathered, Elisha tells the widow to close the door behind herself and her sons. The neighbors have contributed vessels, but they will not become an audience. The next movement belongs inside the threatened household. Behind the door, mercy took the form of repeated work. The widow shuts the door with her sons. Then she pours. The sons bring a vessel. She fills it. They set it aside and bring another. The scene moves with a quiet rhythm. Carry, pour, set aside, return. Nothing in those actions is spectacular by itself. The impossibility lies in the oil. A small jar continues to supply vessel after vessel, while the widow's hands remain active and the sons keep moving through the room. Grace gives their participation meaning without making their participation the source. This balance is central to the story. The widow is neither the source of the provision nor a passive observer. Her sons are neither merely the danger to be avoided nor spectators waiting for rescue. They become participants in the household's deliverance. The narrative places the miracle behind a closed door rather than before a crowd. No audience is described measuring the widow's faith, watching the first drops, or turning her vulnerability into spectacle. The oil begins to multiply in the room where the family has been most afraid. We can imagine the movement without pretending to know every detail. A son placing another vessel within reach. The widow tipping the small jar. The growing weight of oil where emptiness had been. No celebration or astonishment is recorded. The narration stays with the work. Vessel after vessel is filled because the family continues doing what the word required. That narrative restraint gives the miracle dignity. The widow's pain never becomes entertainment, and her rescue requires no public recognition. The people who later see the oil in the marketplace need not witness its sacred beginning behind the door. At last, the widow asks for another vessel. One of her sons answers that there is no other. Then the oil stops. When the final vessel is full, a boundary appears. This particular provision fills the capacity gathered for the task, and then the multiplication ends. That ending matters. The oil is abundant, but it is not endless. Divine generosity is not equated with limitless accumulation. The provision has a destination beyond the room. It must answer the crisis that gave rise to the widow's cry. The stopping also prevents the miracle from replacing wisdom. Full vessels create a new responsibility. The widow now has something valuable, but she still needs instruction about what to do with it. Abundance can become another form of confusion when its purpose is unclear. So she returns to the man of God. His answer contains the moral and practical order of the entire passage. Sell, pay, live, reveals the purpose of the miracle. Elisha tells the widow to sell the oil, pay her debts, and live with her sons on what remains. The miracle enters ordinary economic life. Oil must be taken from the private room into the marketplace. Its value must be converted. The debt must be honored. The future of the household must be managed. Here the story becomes sharper than a general message about God filling emptiness. The oil was given for a purpose. First, the creditor's claim would be answered. Then the widow and her sons would live on the remainder. The order matters. Grace has not made responsibility irrelevant. It has made faithful responsibility possible without destroying the family. That is why the story should not be preached as a prosperity formula. 2 Kings 4 records a particular act of God through Elisha. It guarantees neither a multiplied commodity for every believer in debt, nor visible surplus as the reward of sufficient faith. What emerges is more grounded. God sees a widow whose grief has become economic vulnerability. He treats the threat to her children as worthy of divine attention. His provision works through a prophetic word, the small jar already present, borrowed vessels, the labor of the sons, and the widow's obedience. The result is neither luxury nor spectacle. It is a debt paid and a household preserved. The final command is, live. That word carries the emotional weight of the story. Elisha leaves the duration and shape of their later life unstated. Nothing here promises permanent exemption from labor, risk, or future need. It gives enough information to show that the immediate threat has been answered and the household has a future beyond it. That restraint is part of the truth. God's faithfulness remains real without becoming a guarantee of endless ease. The miracle is complete when it accomplishes the purpose named within the story. Death had already entered the house through the loss of the husband. Debt threatened to remove the sons. The widow came to Elisha because the household was being stripped of its ability to continue. By the end, the sons remain with their mother. The creditor can be paid. There is enough beyond the debt for the family to go on living. Biblical provision is not always measured by excess. In this passage, it is measured by the restoration of a future that was about to be taken. The oil matters because of what it protects. The miracle becomes mercy when the family can remain together, meet its obligation, and continue life beyond the crisis, enough for the house to live. At the beginning of 2 Kings 4, the widow's house is defined by what has been taken and what is about to be taken. Her husband is gone. The debt remains. Her sons are in danger. Elisha receives the crisis as real. He asks what is still in the house, then gives an instruction that brings the widow, her sons, her neighbor's vessels, and the ordinary work of pouring into the shape of God's provision. Behind the closed door, the oil multiplies. When the vessels are full, it stops. Then the miracle moves into responsibility. Sell the oil, pay the debt, live on the rest. That sequence carries the truth of the story. God turns neither the widow's need into spectacle nor material reality into something to deny. He gives provision ordered toward the exact vulnerability before her. The sons remain. The obligation can be met. The household can continue. The story begins with a house nearly emptied by grief and fear. It ends with that same house able to breathe beyond the crisis, not because the widow discovered that she had been sufficient all along, not because emptiness possessed hidden power, because God met a vulnerable family with enough mercy for debt to lose its claim on their future, and for life to remain under their roof.